March 27, 1977. A small island in the Atlantic Ocean, Los Rodeos Airport, Tenerife. What should have been an ordinary day became the deadliest aviation accident in history. Two Boeing 747s, 583 lives lost. No mechanical failure, no terrorism, no bad weather alone. This disaster was caused by words not clearly spoken, warnings not forcefully delivered, and authority that went unchallenged. This is the story of how communication failed and how silence became deadly. It is a tragedy that unfolded slowly, minute by minute, through misunderstandings, assumptions, and hesitation. A chain of small human decisions aligned in the worst possible way, proving that in aviation, what is not said can be just as dangerous as what is said too late.
The disaster did not begin in Tenerife. It began in Las Palmas, where a terrorist bomb exploded inside the airport terminal earlier that day, injuring several people and forcing authorities to shut the airport down indefinitely. With no clear timeline for reopening, air traffic controllers had no choice but to divert incoming flights to alternate airports across the Canary Islands. One of those alternates was Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife, a small, fog-prone regional airport never designed to handle wide-body aircraft, let alone multiple Boeing 747s at the same time. Within hours, the airport was overwhelmed. Taxiways were narrow and poorly suited for large jets. Parking space was extremely limited. There was no ground radar to track aircraft positions. Communication relied entirely on voice radio. Congestion increased by the minute as more aircraft arrived. Among the diverted flights were two giants of the sky. KLM Flight 4850, traveling from Amsterdam to Las Palmas, and Pan Am Flight 1736, en route from Los Angeles to Las Palmas with a stopover in New York. Both aircraft were fully loaded Boeing 747s, carrying hundreds of passengers and crew. With the apron clogged by smaller aircraft, the two 747s were forced to park on the taxiway itself, blocking normal airport movement. Other planes became trapped behind them, unable to reach the runway or reposition. As time passed, frustration grew. Crews were under pressure to depart quickly once Las Palmas reopened. Duty time limits loomed. Weather conditions in Tenerife began to deteriorate, with low clouds and fog rolling across the airfield. What was meant to be a temporary inconvenience quietly transformed into a complex, high-stress environment, one where confusion, impatience, and miscommunication could thrive. The stage was set.
Inside the KLM cockpit sat Captain Jacob Van Zanten. He wasn't just any pilot. Van Zanten was one of KLM's most respected and recognizable aviators. He was among the airline's most senior captains, a highly experienced training captain responsible for shaping the next generation of pilots, and even the public face of KLM's safety campaigns. His image appeared in advertisements, manuals, and promotional material, symbolizing professionalism, discipline, and trust. Inside that cockpit, his authority was absolute. When Las Palmas Airport finally reopened, a new and critical problem emerged: duty time limits. Aviation regulations strictly controlled how long a flight crew could remain on duty. If the KLM aircraft did not depart soon, the crew would exceed those limits and be legally required to stop flying. That would mean an overnight stay in Tenerife, hundreds of frustrated passengers, logistical chaos, and major operational delays. Facing this pressure, Captain Van Zanten made a decisive call. Instead of refueling later in Las Palmas, he chose to fully refuel in Tenerife. On paper, it seemed efficient. In reality, it changed everything. The extra fuel added significant weight to the aircraft, increased the required takeoff distance, and reduced performance margins. It also made aborting a takeoff far more dangerous. Now, pressure surrounded the cockpit from every direction. Time pressure from duty limits, operational pressure from delays and congestion, psychological pressure from authority, expectation, and reputation. And under pressure, human communication changes. Hesitation grows, challenges soften, and critical words are left unsaid.
Then came the fog. Dense, rolling fog swept across the airport. Visibility dropped to less than 300 meters. It rolled in fast, swallowing the tarmac in thick gray silence, turning the entire airfield into an almost featureless void. What had been a busy, bustling airport just minutes before was now a place where nothing could be seen more than a few hundred feet away. Pilots could no longer see the runway stretching ahead of them, each other's aircraft, even at close range, the taxiway exits that were supposed to guide them safely off the active runway. Air traffic controllers were blind, too. Los Rodeos had no ground radar, a critical gap in infrastructure for an airport handling far more traffic than it was ever designed for. There were no electronic eyes watching the movement of aircraft on the ground. Everything, every instruction, every assumption about where planes were depended entirely on radio communication alone. Pan Am was instructed to taxi down the runway and exit at taxiway C3. It seemed straightforward on paper, but the taxiway markings on the ground were unclear, faded, and ambiguous in ways that made them difficult to read even in good conditions. And C3 itself posed a serious geometric problem. It required a sharp, nearly 90-degree turn, a maneuver that was close to impossible for an aircraft as large and unwieldy as a Boeing 747. The Pan Am crew missed the exit, whether from the obscured markings, the difficulty of the turn, or a miscommunication about their position. They rolled past C3 without turning. They were still on the runway, the same runway another aircraft was about to enter. No one could see them.
Back in the KLM cockpit, the aircraft slowly taxied into position and lined up on the active runway, disappearing into the thickening fog. Visibility was poor, and the crew could no longer see the far end of the runway ahead. Everything now depended on radio communication and precise wording. Captain Van Zanten advanced the throttles slightly, a standard technique to stabilize the engines, an unmistakable sign that he was preparing for takeoff. The first officer transmitted a readback to air traffic control, saying, "We are now at takeoff." It was an unusual phrase, ambiguous and dangerously open to interpretation. The controller responded with a critical instruction. "Okay, stand by for takeoff. I will call you." Those words were not a clearance. They were a command to wait. But at that exact moment, Pan Am transmitted a message of its own. The two radio calls overlapped, creating a burst of static that partially blocked the controller's response. Key words were lost in the noise. Inside the KLM cockpit, the captain heard what he expected to hear. Under intense pressure and convinced time was slipping away, he interpreted the transmission as a clearance. Then the flight engineer spoke up, quietly but clearly. Is he not clear then, that Pan American? It was a crucial moment, one last opportunity to stop. Captain Van Zanten replied firmly, "Oh yes." There was no challenge, no insistence on clarification, no assertive correction. The engines roared as the throttles were pushed fully forward, and the aircraft began its fatal takeoff roll. This is where authority gradient becomes lethal. Authority gradient refers to the gap in power, experience, confidence, and perceived authority between members of a flight crew. When that gap becomes too steep, it can silence those who see danger but feel unable to speak up forcefully enough to stop it. Inside the KLM cockpit, the gradient was extreme. The captain was legendary, respected, admired, and feared in equal measure. The first officer was far more junior, trained in a system that emphasized deference. The flight engineer sensed something was wrong, but his concern surfaced only as a question, not a challenge. They noticed uncertainty, they felt doubt, but they did not override authority. Why? Because challenging a senior captain, especially one responsible for training others and representing the airline's safety culture, was culturally and professionally difficult. Speaking up risked embarrassment, conflict, or being seen as insubordinate. At that time, aviation culture reinforced this silence. Questioning captains was quietly discouraged. Cockpits were rigidly hierarchical. Obedience was equated with discipline and professionalism. Confidence from the top was rarely questioned, even when it felt misplaced. The system did not just allow silence, it rewarded it. And in that moment, silence became deadly.
Through the dense fog, Pan Am's crew suddenly saw something impossible. Bright landing lights emerging directly ahead, rushing toward them out of the mist. In that instant, the realization was immediate and terrifying. Another aircraft was on the same runway. The Pan Am captain reacted instinctively. He shouted a warning and attempted a sharp turn off the runway, pushing the throttles forward in a desperate effort to escape. But there was no space and no time. At nearly 140 knots, with engines at full power, the KLM Boeing 747 slammed into the Pan Am aircraft. The impact was catastrophic. The KLM jet briefly lifted into the air, its nose rising as if trying to fly over the obstacle. But the massive fuel load ignited instantly. The aircraft exploded in a violent fireball that tore through the darkness. Everyone aboard the KLM aircraft was killed instantly. The Pan Am 747 was ripped apart, its fuselage shattered, engines were torn away, and flames engulfed the cabin. Inside the wreckage, passengers fought through smoke, heat, and chaos. Against all odds, 61 people managed to escape, crawling through broken sections of the aircraft and running through fire on the runway. When the flames finally subsided, the scale of the tragedy became clear. A total of 583 lives were lost. It remains the deadliest aviation accident in history. A disaster born not of mechanical failure, but of human factors, miscommunication, and moments that could never be undone.
The investigation that followed was exhaustive, involving aviation authorities, engineers, psychologists, and communication experts from multiple countries. Wreckage was analyzed, cockpit voice recordings were reviewed, and radio transcripts were reconstructed word by word. The conclusion was clear and unsettling. There was no mechanical failure. Both aircraft were technically sound. The engines, controls, and systems were functioning exactly as designed. The causes were entirely human. Investigators identified a chain of human and organizational factors that aligned with deadly precision. Non-standard phraseology created ambiguity at a critical moment. The phrase, "We are now at takeoff," was not a recognized clearance and left room for dangerous interpretation. Overlapping radio transmissions masked key instructions, erasing the controller's command to wait. Instead of confirmed, unambiguous communication, assumptions filled the gaps. Those assumptions went unchallenged. Inside the cockpit, authority gradient prevented decisive intervention. Doubt existed, but it was softened. Questions were asked, but they were not pressed. No one forcefully stopped the takeoff. the hierarchy of the cockpit mattered more than the uncertainty in the moment. Most chilling of all, the words "cleared for takeoff" were never spoken by air traffic control. Yet they were heard because they were expected. And in aviation, assumptions replace facts only once. Assumptions kill.
Tenerife rewrote aviation forever. The scale of the tragedy forced the global aviation community to confront an uncomfortable reality. Modern aircraft were no longer the weakest link. Humans were. From the ashes of Tenerife came some of the most profound safety reforms in aviation history, changes that continue to save lives every single day. From this disaster emerged standardized phraseology used worldwide, eliminating vague or interpretive language. Ambiguous words like "okay" were removed from critical communications, replaced with precise, unmistakable commands. Mandatory read-back and hear-back procedures were introduced, ensuring that instructions are not only spoken, but correctly heard, confirmed, and understood by all parties involved. Most importantly, Tenerife gave birth to Crew Resource Management, known as CRM. CRM transformed cockpit culture. It taught that safety is a shared responsibility, not a hierarchy. Every voice matters. Rank does not equal correctness. Experience does not guarantee infallibility. Speaking up is not disrespect. It is a professional duty. Today, first officers and flight engineers are trained to challenge captains clearly, assertively, and repeatedly if safety is at risk. They are expected to intervene, even if it means confronting authority. Because Tenerife proved one enduring truth: authority without challenge is dangerous.
Most importantly, Tenerife gave birth to Crew Resource Management, known as CRM. CRM fundamentally transformed cockpit culture across the world. It taught aviation a hard-earned lesson. Safety is a shared responsibility, not a hierarchy. Every voice matters, regardless of rank. Authority does not equal correctness, and experience does not guarantee infallibility. Speaking up is not an act of defiance, it is a professional duty rooted in responsibility and care for human life. Today, first officers and flight engineers are explicitly trained to challenge captains clearly, assertively, and repeatedly when safety is at risk. They are expected to intervene, even under pressure, even against authority, because hesitation can be fatal. Tenerife proved one enduring truth: authority without challenge is dangerous, especially in the fragile moments that exist between life and death.